up, but we will be reflecting on the condition that we are in as African people. Because it seems as though, on many levels, our condition is getting worse. Is that how it seems to you? Because that's how it seems to me. Because right now, you know, we're used to just talking about, okay, Europeans colonizing us, and we're still trying to get over the legacies of European chattel enslavement. But now we're having to deal with literally every other people on the planet who have their fingers in the African pie. And all the time we have to be asking ourselves, how have we allowed this to happen? In this, the 21st century, so-called, which has been designated the African century, and in this, the designated international year, United Nations, for what that's worth, even though the initiative did not come from them, the International Year of People of African Descent. But it's in this year we are seeing the invasion and the direct attempt to recolonize the northern African country of Libya. So I feel that there is something going on, and there is a clear message to us as African people that we don't have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of time for useless talking. We don't have a lot of time for posturing. We don't have a lot of time for the disunity. We don't have a lot of time for the big egos that often accompany our organizing. Time is running out for us. And I'm not trying to scare anybody, because I think we have to be careful when we're having these conversations, because so many of our people are so, under this weight of oppression that we hear anything more and it's like we just want to hide under the covers. We don't want to come out. But we actually have to begin as a people, as part of our own restoration, to be a people who deal with truth. Yeah? We have to get back to a people who can deal with truth. As our great revolutionary Amilcar Cabral told us, he said that we must tell no lies, expose lies whenever they are told. We must mask no difficulties, mistakes, failures, and we must certainly claim no easy victories. So I'm really just quoting those words back in this year, because they are just as relevant today as they were when he spoke them, that we must claim no easy victories. And this is not going to be an easy victory. But we have to also accept that there is something that has gone radically wrong in our quest towards liberation. There is something radically wrong with our sense of who we are as a people and our levels of consciousness, our levels of African consciousness. Because how else could we explain how in a continent of plenty we have people starving? How in a continent of plenty we have European, Chinese, Syrian, Saudi Arabian, Korean, multinationals, and so-called businessmen buying up land very, very cheaply. Sometimes 1 hectare just costing them $1. How can we explain that in this day and age? So if what we are doing over these 2 days is going to be meaningful, it must be towards really taking stock of our situation, where we are at, how we have come to be here, but more importantly, what we can do to change our condition around. So that is the challenge that we have. The land grabbing that we are seeing in Africa. So I'm not just talking about the NATO, UN, UK, British, French-led interventions in Libya, and Côte d'Ivoire. I'm not talking about that only. I'm talking about the land grabs in particular, whereby we are seeing the 21st century scramble for Africa. And we, the sons and daughters of Africa, are the ones that are continuing to be dispossessed. And so we have to look at Pan-Africanism and our failures to actually develop and build our own power base as African people. We have to look at that, because for all we know about our history, our glorious past, we have to seriously assess how it is that in this time, when we know so much about who we are and who we have been, that we are not able to use this knowledge to lift ourselves up. And we have to ask ourselves some serious questions, not just for ourselves, but for those children, the children who are here in this room, the children who are yet to be born. What are we going to tell the children about this time, about this generation, about what we allowed to happen on our watch? What are we going to tell our children? What do you tell your children now when they look around at the world that we have failed to build for them? So I'm not really here to get into that. You know, we love to do that coming together, and many people have abandoned the church, so we like to hear another kind of preaching. So I'm not here to do that, because our condition is far too serious for me to come here and stand before you and do that. So the land grabs that are taking place in Africa, because of so-called food shortages, food riots that we saw in 2008, 2009. And so many countries now are acquiring land in Africa to grow their food, to benefit their citizens. But we have Africans who are starving and who are recipients of food aid, and goodness knows what else is being put in the food that we know, and that, you know, is being handed out by agencies such as the World Food Organization, the United Nations, etc., etc. And then we know what's happening via our food, because we know that whoever controls our food supply controls the world. So when we're looking at the attack on African people, let's not just look at the bombs that are being dropped in countries such as Libya. Let's not solely look at the role of AFRICOM, the USA Africa Command, that is strategically placing itself and so-called intervening in many conflicts that have been created by Western powers. Let's not just look at that, but let's also look at the bombs that are coming into our own homes via the media, via the agendas that are being promoted by these United Nations organizations, via the population control, and in particular sisters in the room. This is where they're attacking us, because they don't actually want us to reproduce. They want less of us on the planet, and then we get spun these lies that Africa is overpopulated, that there's too many of us. There was some big story in 2010 about the population of Africa reaching 1 billion. But actually, African countries are underpopulated. It's European countries, in terms of their population density, that are overpopulated. So they're trying to encourage us to, have their birth control and so forth. And then they're, talking about HIV, AIDS, and then they're infecting a lot of condoms and so forth and giving these to our people and saying that we're having too many children because they don't want many more of us to be born. And whilst we're dying of diseases that were long eradicated in Europe and North America and Western countries, They are there strategically repositioning themselves whilst we're here talking for African liberation. So whilst we're here, many of us talk about going back home. We talk about repatriation. But many of us are not doing that. And then guess what? When you go back to wherever your home is or wherever you choose, you're seeing an immigration officer that looks like the Caucasian that we leave here. And they're the ones training our immigration officers. And our countries are following their dictates and their policies. So we have a problem. We have a problem. Those of us in the reparations movement have long been talking about the reparations process not just being about financial compensation, which is how a lot of people understand reparations, and certainly there is a financial debt that we are owed. But our fundamental acts of self-repair is about us evolving our unity project and ensuring that we are able to build and evolve an African superpower, an African state, a Pan-African Union, not the African Union, but a Pan-African Union. It's been called various things. Professor Chinwezu has spoken about the Black World League of Nations. We ourselves in the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, who I represent, have come up with a concept called Ma'at Ubuntuman, which basically means a Pan-African state union that is built on and premised on the principles of Ma'at. Because we have a serious problem with the models of governance and state building that we have been adopting in Africa. Because we are emulating, we are imitating their models of statehood. And then we wonder why we have so many civil conflicts. Then we wonder why we have so many ethnic divisions. Because we are following their models of so-called good governance and democracy, which has never even worked in their societies, in their ideal societies of Greece and Rome. It did not exist. But yet we are hearing African leaders talking about the rule of law and good governance and democracy. So the challenge that we have, brothers and sisters, is the challenge to build an Africa, including us, not just Africa as a continent, but a global geopolitical reality that can encompass us as members of the diaspora, as the sixth region of Africa, a polity that is not built on the models of statehood that we learned from Europe, but a Sankofa, going back to the best of our own models of governance that we have evolved in our high civilizations. And that is our challenge for this century. That is what we have to do as African people. So wherever we are, we must be educating ourselves about the need for this reality. Because until we have that, none of us is guaranteed any security, human or otherwise. I mean, let's face it. We are the people who are more likely to be victims of crime. And apart from the crimes of colonialism, the crimes of chattel enslavement, the crimes of neo-colonialism, we are also committing crimes on each other. And we have been criminalized as a people. And then we run to their law courts to try and adjudicate our disputes between one another. And then we have the prison industrial complex. And if we look at what's happening on a global scale, whenever they don't like what our leaders do, And whenever they decide not to follow their dictates anymore, they haul them before the International Criminal Court, which is really Europe's Guantanamo Bay for African heads of state. That's not me saying it. This is what their own scholars are saying. Their own scholars are saying the International Criminal Court is a court that has been designed to try African heads of state. And we're seeing that that's what they're endeavoring to do by saying they want to prosecute, among others, Colonel Gaddafi and his son. So when we look at the whole question of law and how law is being used to further this imperial wars of aggression, we have to re-examine our connection to the law and how we use law as a means of mediating our disputes. And we have the challenge of building alternative systems of law and of governance. So this is part of our self-repair. One of the basic things that we can do is begin to de-recognize many of their legal constructs and systems. This is part of how we begin to take back our power, by de-recognizing even their borders in Africa, which were not just created like that. They were created through acts of European law. The Berlin Act, the Congress Act, that's what it was, of 1884, 1885, in terms of the beginnings of what they would call international law, where they carved up Africa. So part of what they have been doing, apart from using missionaries and apart from using overt warfare, they use the system of law as a way of keeping us down and further colonizing us. So part of our repair and reparations, self-repair as African people, must be to challenge the existing legal modalities and frameworks that we have inherited. And that includes the framework around how we achieve reparations. Now, as somebody with a legal background myself, I'm sure you've heard me speak before on the legal case that we took in this country, which was attempting to sue Her Royal Highness, Queen Elizabeth II. And the reason why we did that, and as a legal advisor to the Black Quest for Justice campaign that initiated this legal action, after the 2002 follow-up to the World Conference Against Racism for Africans and their descendants in Barbados. Part of why we did this is because we know that in terms of Britain's role in chattel enslavement, it was Queen Elizabeth I that was on the throne that actually sanctioned, gave state backing to their colonial wars of aggression and dispossession, through which many of us are still feeling the legacies today. So in 2003, we engaged in what we called a critical legal action against not only Her Royal Highness, Queen Elizabeth II, but many multinationals. We included the Roman Catholic Church, all the different parties that we believed and held accountable for historical and contemporary crimes against African people, including crimes of genocide. Now, the reason why we did this is because through their law and through their operation of international criminal law, they enacted a law in the UK in 2001, which was the law around crimes against humanity. And as you will remember, after the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, where it was declared that slavery was a crime against humanity and should always have been so, we sought to use their law to expose the law, their law, for being inadequate to meet our Pan-African reparations justice claims. And the reason we had to do it in that way is because many people to this day believe that, all we need to do is sue them. We just need to get our best lawyers together and we sue them in their courts. But actually, that's not the way it works. Because they're the ones that create the system and the framework, and they're the ones that change the legal norms and boundaries through which we're operating in. So we sought to sue Queen Elizabeth II, who, by the way, is still, as a title, she is the world's largest landowner. She holds legalized, I should say, title to over 1/6 of planet Earth. Over 1/6. So when we're talking about reparations as African people, we have to link it clearly and squarely to our struggle to reclaim our lands and title to our lands, not only in Africa, but worldwide. Because what we gained on so-called independence was we lost our sovereignty, but we gained their borders and their constructs. And part of the repairs is about reclaiming our sovereignty, which means delegitimizing, derecognizing their borders. And there is no court on this planet as yet that has the power or the moral authority or mandate to adjudicate a Pan-African reparations claim. So what happened? We initiated this legal action, and this was in 2003, the same year when they removed Saddam Hussein, as you can recall, and killed him. He was meant to be a sovereign head of state, and we were told by the Attorney General that you cannot sue Queen Elizabeth II because she is a head of state and she is sovereign. So right there, we expose the legal system for its hypocrisy. And that is one of the simple things that we can do. And those of us who are interested in the law and how the law is operating in our lives, that is the work that we have been engaging in, working with other lawyers, and what we do, we call it legal literacy, and raising legal consciousness amongst the African masses, because that is one of the key ways in which they are continuing to dispossess us. So what we have been building towards is an international court or tribunal, not the International Criminal Court, not the World Court, so-called, where America has said none of its citizens will go before it, but yet America as a state has been one of the biggest purveyors of violence and crimes against humanity, and especially when it comes to the dispossession of African people. So what we are building up towards is the international pressure to create a truly world court that will be made up of justices who stem from the indigenous peoples of the planet, African peoples and other indigenous peoples, all those of us who've experienced European colonial invasions and aggression. This is what we are building towards. But unless we are able to delegitimize their existing systems, then many of us will keep submitting ourselves, prostrating ourselves before them, expecting justice. So the cause of African reparations is really what Reclaiming Africa is about. And if we understand reparations in its true meaning, It just means to make repairs. So when we look at the different repairs that we have to make, they come under 5 main headings, those being restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, something called satisfaction, something called guarantees of non-repetition. And this is the apparent international legal framework around reparations. And many of us who hear the term reparations just automatically go to compensation. But let me just give you an idea of what reparations in its holistic sense looks like. First of all, before we can have true reparations, we have to begin with stopping the continuing human and people's rights violations that are being committed against us as African people. How can we be talking about reparations when we're still being colonized, we're still being oppressed, we're still experiencing racism, we're still experiencing dispossession? So we cannot have reparations until we stop the crimes of the present, which have a historical antecedent in chattel and colonial enslavement. We also have to put a full stop to the structurally violent plunder of our material resources, our lands and our minerals, as well as our brain drain, which has become a brain gain to Western countries. That includes so-called recognition of foreign debts. Our countries are supposedly indebted, but we know that they owe us. And so there's a concept in law called odious debt, whereby you say that we are not acknowledging that we owe you a debt, you owe us, and we are refusing to pay. That's what our African governments need to be doing, because they are paying back loans, supposedly, that were taken out with the IMF and the World Bank, and the money that should be going to develop their citizenry and building social and educational and health and welfare services are going back into the hands of Europe. We also need the exoneration and the release of our political prisoners of conscience and our modern day prisoners of war. And there are so many to name, but some famous ones that you will know are people like Mumia Abu-Jamal, people like Assata Shakur, who is in Cuba in exile, people like Debbie Sims, Dr. Matula Shakur, etc. It also will involve instituting measures of community self-defense so that we can defend our communities. This is the self-reparations. We are moving towards evolving the reparations concept to looking at reparations for despoilation of our natural environment, all the toxic waste that they are dumping in African countries, sending all their old computers and dumping them out there, which are causing environmental and birth defects in Africans being born today. This is part of the reparations claim. We are talking about a public acknowledgement of the facts, including a truthful telling of the story, as well as acceptance of responsibility. We are talking about judicial and administrative sanctions against persons responsible. So instead of them dragging African heads of state before the International Criminal Court, what about those perpetrators of the African Holocaust of enslavement that are still alive today? And I would name some of the British heads of state in that regard, as well as heads of state of America, and many of those who are running around in Africa who were responsible for apartheid, not only in South Africa, but in many other African countries, who are still living today. And all we had was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they got to say sorry. We're talking about the development of historical museums and monuments. Now that is before we even come to reparations. Restitution, and that includes the entire spectrum of attempts to rectify the historical injustice. What will restitution look like? It will involve revoking the papal bulls, which is what gave the Roman Catholic Church the mandate to go off and send people in their colonial wars of civilization and aggression against us who were considered to be heathens. They used Roman papal bulls, which are still in force today. So it means revoking that. It means a restoration of our liberty, our family life, our citizenship, a return to our place of residence, which is repatriation, a return of our employment in terms of what we have lost. Many of us who have begun tracing our family lineages know the family lines that we came from, know what we've lost. We know who were the priests amongst us. We know who were the artisans amongst us. We know what were the professional lineages amongst us, and we can calculate that in monetary terms. It involves a redrawing of the colonial borders of Africa. It involves evolving the African Union into a United States, a Ma'at or Buntaman, a Pan-African Union, a Pan-African statehood with veto powers in any international organization, and we're looking beyond the United Nations. Other people have developed a concept such as the Black World League, the Black Star Constellation of Nations. We need to have communal repossession of lands, not just the private property notion of leasehold and freehold that has been exported around the world, that we're still suffering from because of the 6.5 billion people on planet Earth. Only 15% have legal title to land. That's how the private property system is actually continuing to impoverish not only African people, but many of the other impoverished peoples of the world. It will involve an African rememory process, which is a process of reclaiming our own historical memory, which is necessary to heal the psychic injuries caused by centuries of cultural and spiritual murder. Many of us walking around in our frames, but we are spiritually and culturally dead. Dead to ourselves, no good to ourselves, not able to think for ourselves, and certainly not able to do for ourselves. It will involve reclaiming, restoring, renewing, and regenerating our African identity and personality. This is part of restitution. Looking at reparations holistically. It will be an elimination of Africidal traits, including internalized Afrophobia, which is anti-African prejudice and discrimination, Europhilia and Arabophilia, in terms of our love of everything European and Arab. It will include a restoration and renewal of our cultures and our indigenous African languages. It will include returning and renewing and advancing indigenous African knowledge systems, our languages, our spirituality, our philosophies, our music, our art, our symbolism, our science and technology, and also organized voluntary repatriation. This will also be about the reunification of the global African family. This is part of our restitution and self-repairs as African people. Pan-African citizenship. So not just citizenship of individual African countries that many of us are calling for. We need a Pan-African citizenship because we have to be global citizens and see ourselves as global citizens. We're talking about eradicating institutionalized and structural Afrophobia that we see in every institution on planet Earth. Every institution of law, of governance, of science, of technology, of education, miseducation. This is structural Afrophobia. That needs to be eradicated. Now that is just restitution. Under rehabilitation, We're talking about respecting and enhancing our indigenous institutions and our treatments and modes of care and healing, our natural healers. And there's a big attack on that with the Codex Alimentarius, which I'm sure you're already aware of. It will include us working to end intergenerational trauma and its effects, healing from our intergenerational Stockholm syndrome, where we identify more with our oppressors than we identify with ourselves. It will include the provision of culturally appropriate medical and social care and welfare facilities for African peoples. It will also be about culturally competent institutions of rehabilitation and care. So not their mental institutions, not their prison institutions. We have the responsibility of rebuilding an African world and our African civilization. That is what we have to do in this century. It will also include free social security and education for African people. Now, compensation will be a calculation of financial compensation which will focus not only on wages and salaries, but also lost potential income. Potential income is what you could have earned, what we have been deprived of in terms of our legacy and our inheritance, had we been paid wages for all the work that we have been doing for centuries. Another way to compute this financial compensation is not to think about lost wages to the enslaved and their descendants who are us, but also wealth gained by those who have deprived us and our ancestors of our liberty and our inheritance. So if we look at the gain to Europe, if we look at the gain to America, if we look at the gain to the rest of the world who is still feeding off of us today, that is a financial sum that we can do. So this is included in the financial compensation. There are other types of economic harm. There are broader consequences associated with being unemployed, consequences of us having lower salaries, consequences of us being associated with having unpaid work. There are severe health consequences from being unemployed. All of this has a financial component. To the extent that there are severe unemployment consequences, not only are we unemployed, we are underemployed. There is a financial sum that we can calculate for what that would cost. And we remember that the British enslavers, invaders, were compensated to the tune of what was £20 million in 1833. And that was just for those who they had their property, which was our ancestors. And that was just in the Caribbean. So let's work out the global maths. So compensation will include a long-term commitment to financing, resourcing and supporting all the efforts that we as African people make to repair the damage, to try and make good losses suffered as a result of the Holocaust of chattel, colonial and neo-colonial enslavement and its legacies that are impacting on us today. It will include restitution of the value of unjust enrichment based upon slave and colonial labour, not only in the diaspora, not only in the plantations of the Caribbean and the Americas, but also on the continent of Africa, where there was colonial enslavement. It will include financial enrichment in terms of the expropriations of lands, minerals and raw materials that are continuing to be extracted today by European transnational corporations. Damages for physical or mental harm, including pain, suffering and emotional distress. Damages for lost opportunities, including our opportunities to have proper education, employment, recreation and leisure. It will include funds for scholarships and community development, damages for harm to our reputation and our dignity. We've been hearing about all these cases, all these super injunctions in this country, these so-called stars who are going to court to protect their reputation. But what about our global reputation as African people that has never been regained as a result of what has happened to us? What is the financial cost of our reputation whenever you walk in a store and somebody is following you around simply because of the colour of your skin, because they have a concept of who we are, regardless of whether they are from the North Pole or the South Pole? That is the reality of what we need to be compensated for. So there's a whole heap, and that was only 2 that I've read out, and time is not on my side. Rehabilitation is a key area. Spoken a bit about that, but in terms of satisfaction and guarantees of non-repetition, that's critical. Satisfaction and guarantees of non-repetition will include us reasserting our sovereignty of Africans and our descendants, evolving the African Union into a superpower, and compelling universal recognition around the world for this. So that is a fundamental act of self-repair that we have to do. Our oppressors are not going to do that for us. In fact, they have recolonized Africa already. It will also include judicial and administrative sanctions against the persons responsible. We've spoken about a true and international court, but we have started with a concept called the People's International Tribunal for Global Justice, which many of us are organising internationally to establishing this tribunal. And in the UK, we are calling for an parliamentary commission on truth, justice and conciliation for the crimes of enslavement. And that will be an international commission to look at Britain's role globally in dispossessing African people, not just in Europe or in Britain, but Britain's role as part of empire. So that is our challenge as African people. And one of the fundamental things that we need to do, we need to effect reparations of the law. We need legal repairs because many people think that we can use their laws to get justice. No, we cannot. We need the concept of legal repairs, and we need to go back to developing and enforcing our will as African people within legal systems and frameworks. Indigenous peoples have an Indigenous Peoples Convention. Indigenous peoples, the Aboriginals, the Indigenous peoples are laws recognised within institutions of state. We have African laws. We have Indigenous African laws and African systems of governance that we need to go back to. One of the key principles of law and justice we know is the system of Ma'at. So we have to Sankofa. We have to go back into our past and rebuild that, the best of our past in our future. And that is our historic mission as African people. So I just wanted to leave you with those few words on the challenge that we have as African people in this century. And I want to remind us that we can achieve this. A content in our consciousness as African people. And therefore, we not repeat the mistakes of our past. We have to look, we eliminate the weaknesses amongst us. Professor Chimwezu has spoken about the weaknesses of organisation, the weaknesses of solidarity, the weaknesses of our identity, the weaknesses of our mentality, of our behaviour. If we cannot correct such weaknesses, even if we got back all of our expropriated land, we would fritter away yet again and recycle it back into alien hands. Brothers and sisters, is our challenge of reparations. And the key to that is self self-reparation. Because when we begin the process of self-reparations, there is no power that will be formed against us that will be able to stand. They will be coming to us for inclusion instead of us going to them under the illusions of inclusion as Minister Farrakhan has spoken about. So that is what we have to do. Let's stop looking at what they're doing to us and let us rebuild our world. Because we lost a world. We didn't just lose a paycheck. We didn't just lose a job. We lost a world. And we lost our civilization.